I hope the perpetrators will feel an urgency to speak up after the story I've told you today, so that they can look in the mirror and don't have to lie to their children or grandchildren about what they did on July 17, 2014. That's not a line from a politician. That's from a Dutch father who lost all three of his daughters when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was blown out of the sky. What happened next exposed something far bigger than one missile. It revealed the core of Vladimir Putin's regime: criminality as policy. In Putin's Russia, killing civilians isn't just a consequence, it's a strategy. And while MH17 was the wake-up call, the full picture goes much deeper. From assassinations abroad to massacres in Ukraine, from nerve agents and perfume bottles to children abducted across borders. This is how Russia exports violence. And the question we all must ask is, why is this regime still being treated like a normal state when it behaves more like a mafia cartel with nukes? The MH17 flight was supposed to be routine, Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, but that sky had become a war zone, and at 16:20 local time, everything changed. 298 people, children, parents, grandparents, gone in seconds. The weapons fragments told the story no propaganda could erase. It was a Book 9 M317 surface-to-air missile. Russia tried to say that it was a Ukrainian book left over from Soviet times. Too bad, then, that phone calls of the Russian flunkies admitting their involvement were intercepted. The European Court of Human Rights later ruled Russia responsible. The downing of a civilian airliner was hardly the first atrocity committed by Putin's regime. The wider world was just getting a taste of what Russians had been experiencing. As early as 2006, when people were still under the illusion that Putin wasn't a dictator, the Russian government was up to its usual tricks. October 7th. Anna Politkovskaya is found dead in the stairwell of her Moscow apartment building with a pistol and spent shell casings near her body. It's a suspected contract killing, especially because she's had a close call before. 5 years earlier, she was investigating Russian military atrocities in Chechnya. The authorities didn't take that well. She was detained on the job and threatened with rape and torture. The soldiers even said they'd harm her kids. Later released, she still kept at it until that night. 6 people were suspected of being involved in the case, and 5 were eventually tried and convicted. But the question of who ordered the killing was never answered. That's just the way it is in Putin's Russia. In Putin's Russia, past loyalty won't save you. Just ask his former deputy prime minister. Boris Nemtsov was a deputy prime minister of Russia in 1997-1998, but became a critic of Putin. As far as critics go, he lasted a long time, but as Putin's grip on power got tighter with the years, he became more brazen. Nemtsov was shot and killed on a bridge on February 27, 2015. The bridge happened to be right outside the Kremlin's walls. Oh, sure, 5 men took the fall for the murder, but as far as conspiracies go, it was pretty basic, at least as far as Russia's court system was concerned. Nemtsov's family and sympathetic figures knew it went far higher, but no good judge in Putin's Russia would allow that sort of thing to get out. No discussion of Nemtsov's status as an opposition leader was allowed in the trial. Nemtsov's daughter complained bitterly that the investigators and court denied the obvious, which meant they had failed to establish any sort of motive for the murder. But after MH17, Putin's playbook changed. What Russia once kept at home, it started exporting with deadly precision. June 30th, 2018. 44-year-old Dawn Sturgis is being rushed into intensive care after a horrific accident, but not a normal one. She sprayed herself with what she thought was perfume. This was no fragrance. The bottle contained a nerve agent in doses large enough to kill thousands. Just 1/3 to 1/6 of a grain of salt is all it takes to kill one. She died 9 days later. Her partner and a police officer who had investigated the earlier Skripal poisoning were hospitalized but fortunate enough to survive. But what was this nerve agent? Novichok, a chemical weapon developed in the Soviet Union. Putin's regime sent it to the UK to get rid of yet another enemy, a defected spy, Sergei Skripal. He and his daughter were found foaming at the mouth on a public bench and survived the assassination attempt, but the thugs involved left the bottle lying around to do its lethal work later. As far as Putin is concerned, the death of a British civilian he'd never heard of was acceptable collateral damage. and his tolerance for acceptable collateral damage is high indeed. Karam Al-Masri, a local photojournalist, reports a ghastly sight to Human Rights Watch from Aleppo. "I saw the building completely razed to the ground. One child was wedged between the rubble. Her blood was dripping. Her father was at work and arrived half an hour later and fell into tears. When they pulled the child out, he collapsed on the ground. He didn't let the civil defense take her. He kept saying, 'She's asleep, she's just asleep,' but he couldn't wake her up." After Putin flexed his muscles in Ukraine, unilaterally annexing Crimea and shooting down civilian airliners, he got the idea to intervene in the Syrian civil war. His buddy, Bashar al-Assad, who was also a fan of chemical weapons, was in trouble, and Putin didn't want to lose Russia's only naval base on the Mediterranean. So the Russian military conducted airstrikes on the rebels against Assad's regime. But here's the thing: Russia doesn't fight its wars the way the United States does. Russia's war strategy? Forget precision. For Putin, shock and terror are cheaper and more effective. When Russia goes to war, it doesn't even bother trying to be accurate with its weapons to save on cost, so why would it bother with trying to be accurate to limit harm to civilians? The fight for Aleppo between 2012 and 2016 was so fierce, it was called Syria's mother of all battles. Russia turned the tide in it not by systematically destroying enemy military forces, but by destroying the civil infrastructure in their districts. The airstrikes started on the hospitals. Some of them tried to reopen after being damaged, but the Russian aircraft was relentless. If hospitals tried to move to a new location, the bombs would follow them there. Over 30 separate attacks on hospitals were recorded from July 2016. By November, the last one went down, leaving 250,000 of the city's residents without hospital access. Witnesses report seeing babies dying because oxygen tanks were empty and generators had stopped working. The hospitals were just one piece of the infrastructure the Russians went after. The airstrikes targeted roads in rebel-held districts. Okay, you might think that kind of makes sense in a military setting, because no military commander can let enemy forces get supplies so easily. But schools, really? Yes, schools. The Russians targeted those too. The bombing campaign even extended to civilian homes. That's how Karam al-Masri came upon the wrecked building with the dead little girl lodged in the rubble. Human Rights Watch reported that according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, between just September and October of 2016, up to 457 civilians, including 85 children, were killed in Russia's airstrikes in Aleppo, but the true figure was likely higher. At any rate, it worked out for Putin. Assad was safe, at least for 8 more years, and all of this was still just the dress rehearsal. By 2021, Putin was ascendant. He'd succeeded in silencing almost all of his domestic enemies, seemed to have his way in Syria, and controlled Crimea and much of eastern Ukraine, while the West seemed weak and divided. Why not go for broke? His own intelligence services told him that no brutality would be needed. The people would throw flowers at his soldiers' feet. That didn't happen, so brutality came back, grander in scale and ghastlier in form. April 8, 2022. Barely a month has passed, but things haven't gone as well for Putin as he'd hoped for in this so-called special military operation. So Russia launches a Tachka-U ballistic missile at a train station in Kramatorsk in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast. That might not sound surprising. Russia launched missiles at civilian targets in Ukraine since the day the war started, but this one was different. The missile was equipped with a cluster warhead. These warheads don't detonate in one blast. Instead, they break apart into separate bomblets which explode over a much wider area. They're designed to kill or maim as many people as possible, and that's exactly what happened on that day. The attack killed 58 civilians and wounded at least 100 more. Russia's use of cluster bombs in civilian areas in Ukraine has been extensive. Putin's regime has targeted everything from schools to hospitals to residential areas with them. Sure, every last one of these incidents was a war crime. But since when did Putin care about that? A year after the Kramatorsk attack, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said that 174,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory had been littered with unexploded but still active cluster bomblets that killed 226 people in March 2023 alone. That's the thing with cluster bombs. Many of the bomblets fail to detonate on impact and become like landmines, where they can remain deadly for decades or more. Unexploded ordnance from World War I is still claiming victims over a century later. Putin's regime would say that Ukraine has been behaving just like Russia. It also isn't part of the Convention on Cluster Munitions and has been using cluster bombs supplied from the United States. That part is true, at least. There are just two important differences. First, the American bomblets are a lot likelier to explode on impact, with a 2.35% dud rate compared to 40% for Russia's bomblets. Oh, and Ukraine is only using its cluster bombs against military targets, not on playgrounds for children. And yet, the people in places like Kramatorsk are, by comparison, the lucky ones. They have the good fortune of living in areas that Russian troops haven't stepped foot in. It's a much grimmer story for their countrymen who are trapped behind the lines. Mariupol was one of the first major Ukrainian cities to fall to Putin's advancing armies, and it fell fast. For Yulia and Tatiana, the nightmare came faster. Their story was just the beginning. There's not a single family in Mariupol who didn't bury someone or doesn't know someone who did, Tatiana said. For them, it started with a close call. A bomb hit their block with a blast powerful enough to shatter windows and shake their building like it was in an earthquake. Fortune was smiling on them here, too. Their apartment didn't suffer serious damage, but when they took off to take shelter in the basement, they realized their neighbors weren't so lucky. They desperately shook their doors trying to get out, but couldn't. The shockwave jammed them. Then a fire broke out, and they had no choice but to jump out of their windows. Then a second bomb went off. Tatiana crashed into the wall with enough force to break her arm, but she didn't have the luxury of medical attention. She and her daughter made it to the basement, where they stayed with over 50 people for a week. It was cold, and there wasn't much food or water to go around, but the horrors had still only begun. With Russian troops advancing all around them, there was only one choice. They had to escape to safer territory. Along the way, they learned about something called a filtration screening. They were caught and kept in holding, awaiting evaluation. Russian troops took front and side photos of their faces, their fingerprints, and other biometrics, carried out body and luggage searches, and subjected them to intrusive interrogation about their political sensibilities. Ukrainian civilians report that many of their countrymen subjected to these screenings might have to wait in holding for up to a month under squalid conditions. Yulia and Tatiana's good fortune continued to hold. They were released and eventually made it to the safety of Lviv. Many others weren't so lucky. But Yulia and Tatiana's story was only one piece of a much darker pattern. What happened to them in Mariupol was devastating, but it wasn't isolated. Just northwest of there, towns like Bucha revealed the true scale of Russia's brutality. Investigators uncovered mass graves, torture chambers, and summary executions. A woman named Olena described how a teenage Russian conscript pointed an assault rifle at her face just days after another soldier murdered her husband in cold blood. These weren't rogue units. Witness testimony and international observers pointed to systemic patterns. Survivors described scenes that felt ripped from a dystopian video game, soldiers looting, laughing, and shooting civilians at will. The trauma in Bucha became a global symbol, but it wasn't the only one. Across occupied areas like Irpin, Kherson, and Melitopol, similar horrors surfaced. Civilians gunned down while fleeing, families forced to dig graves, and children taken from parents under the guise of protection. According to Human Rights Watch, over 14 million Ukrainians have been displaced, while millions more lost power, water, or heat as Russia deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure. What makes this even more chilling? It's not chaos, it's calculated. Just like in Syria, where Russia bombed maternity wards and hospitals in Aleppo, Ukraine became a testing ground for a strategy where civilian suffering is the point. These tragedies aren't the result of breakdowns. They're part of the blueprint, and the Russian state isn't just tolerating war crimes, it's engineering them. For families across Ukraine, the blueprint meant personal devastation. One of them was Ludmila, a mother living in the small village of Posad Pogrovsky, just north of the southern front lines. While Russia's offensives on other fronts stalled, the southern offensive was far more successful. Places like Mariupol and Kherson are a lot closer to occupied Crimea, Russia's major supply hub, so the invaders had an easier time of it. They captured Kherson and continued moving northwest, getting as far as Voznesensk in Mykolaiv Oblast. Ludmila and her family were directly in the advancing Russian sights. Just days after the invasion, they captured the village of Chernobivka. Occupation was swift, and reports of atrocities started to circulate quickly. Local Ukrainian officials reported that Russian troops massacred at least 18 civilians there. Ludmila, living in the village of Posad Pokrovsky, 27 kilometers away further north, must have been feeling anxious. Her husband had gone to Chernobivka for work. Then she got the call on March 10th. His bruised body had been found in a ditch with a gunshot wound in the neck. She couldn't go claim the body either because it was too dangerous. He was going to be buried in a mass grave. It took special pleading for her to bury him in a dedicated grave. She still couldn't go to the burial. It might have been specially chosen on a day when local officials determined there was less shelling, but she had to watch on a video call. Her house was also damaged in Russian shelling, and she was now faced with raising her 3 daughters alone in a war-torn country where the horrors awaiting the living might be even worse. The living have to watch Russia's occupation every day. Nastya from Zelenivka near Kherson had to watch as her father was beaten and taken away. Then the Russian troops threatened to rape her in front of her boyfriend. Both eventually escaped to Kiev, but they still don't know what happened to him. Other civilians report that they or their family members were detained and tortured. The Russian forces apparently suspect these people as being particularly problematic, but even the ones that weren't are subject to the ultimate humiliation. In July 2021, Putin released an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In the very first sentence, he said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people. In other words, Ukraine never really existed, and his forces behave accordingly. The people in Kurs Oblast, at least those west of the river, had a stroke of luck. Ukrainian troops retook the area in November 2022, but those still living behind the lines are still going through what they did, the process of Russification. Putin started issuing Russian passports to residents in the occupied areas after he claimed to annex them. He'd do it to all of Ukraine if he could. There was a reason for that. Ukrainian civilians are forced into re-education. They're forced to sing Russian patriotic hymns, say that their homeland is Russia, and watch as their children get taken away. Putin doesn't get around much these days. That's because on March 17, 2023, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest, obligating all member states to detain him the moment he steps foot on their soil. He's wanted on charges of the unlawful deportation of children and unlawful transfer of children from occupied areas in Ukraine to Russia. One could argue the charges were too light. Children aren't the only ones being transferred. Neither they nor their parents have escaped the grip of Putin's regime. No one really knows how many Ukrainian nationals have been deported to Russia. 300,000 Ukrainian nationals got Russian citizenship in 2022 when Putin claimed the annexation of the 4 oblasts his troops partially occupied: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported that 1.27 million so-called refugees from Ukraine were recorded in Russia by June 2023. Maria Lvova-Belova, the woman with the positively Orwellian title of Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia and who was indicted by the ICC along with her boss, claims that 700,000 Ukrainian children entered her country by August 2023. Not to worry, though. She says the vast majority were accompanied by parents or relatives. Other sources give much lower numbers. A team of experts at Yale say 35,000 children may be held in Russia or the occupied territories. The lower number isn't much comfort, though. They fear the kids were part of illegal adoptions or even sent to military camps. Unfortunately, it's hard to document the abuses in those places, but we might have some clues. Deporting Ukrainian civilians, especially children, makes sense for Putin since his goal is to Russify the population. Once in Russia, they are re-educated and taught to believe in things like the importance of disarming Ukraine and serving the motherland. But Putin's regime also understands that this program could bring problems if not managed carefully. So, by 2024, Russia came up with a solution with a Chinese feel. The deportees are carefully surveilled, especially the teenagers. There's special software, Profilaktika. It's a product of the Center for the Study and Network Monitoring of the Youth Environment, an organization with ties to the Russian Ministry of Education. It tracks teenagers' data, everything from where they live to what they post online, and assigns them opposition scores and destructiveness scores. Unfortunately, the reporting stops short of saying what happens to those who don't have the right numbers, but we can't imagine that it's anything good. Ukrainian officials quietly and sadly admit that these children are out of reach and almost impossible to bring back home. President Bush once infamously said that he looked Putin in the eye in 2006 and got a sense of his soul. It was a straightforward and trustworthy one, he thought. He should have listened to Robert Andrew, Foreign Service officer who was with the Russian president just minutes before Bush's arrival. He intensely and icily sized up everyone in the room, like a hardened criminal. That observation was the most accurate predictor of Russia's behavior in the decade since. So now you've seen it. MH17, Bucha, Syria, Salisbury, even children being reprogrammed and deported by the thousands. If this is the behavior of a legitimate government, then the word criminal has no meaning. So tell us, is the world doing enough to stop Putin's regime? Or are we still pretending it's business as usual? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're interested in how global powers rise, fall, and reshape the world we all live in, subscribe to Fall of Nations. It not only helps you stay informed, it really helps us keep this channel going. Because as the balance shifts, we're here to help you understand what's really changing and why it matters.